Welcome to the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Grant Interviews. Each one of our interviewees is competing for a $2,000 grant to help fund their summer research. Do you want to have a say in Hello again, everybody. We are back with our second guest of this afternoon. So everybody say hello. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. How are you doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Would you mind just opening by telling us who you are and where you're currently studying?
Okay, I'm Felix Rauhaus and I'm studying in Germany. I'm writing my Ph.D. thesis here in Munich.
Thank you. And
Yes.
what's your current research interest that you're working on for your PhD?
I've also studied economics, and my research interest is mainly the combination of both Assyriology and economics right now. I'm writing my PhD on the middle to late third millennium BC, and my research question is basically to draw up a picture of income inequality, which is basically how much money does everybody make.
That's really interesting. Thank you. What drew you first to economics and then to Assyriological economics? Because that's quite a specialist field.
Yeah, well, I basically studied both as bachelor, and then I decided to continue the master in Assyriology only, and then, yeah, I hope I understood the question correctly.
Yes, you did. Thank you. What are your current summer plans and how could HAPS help you with those?
So I'm also working, because I studied economics, a lot with statistics, and statistics need time. So I've been working 2 years on looking at the administrative documents that help give the data, building up the database, and discussing what the data is able to tell us and what it doesn't. And I'm starting to finish the database finally. So now I really want to evaluate it this summer, basically, and then finish up afterwards.
Excellent, thank you. And having built my own database, not for economic documents, you're right, it takes an awfully long time to collate all of that information. How many tablets roughly are you working with?
So I don't think tablet number is too much of help, because some are very large and some are very small. So it's, I don't know, up to 100 I'm really including, but the amount of people I'm including is more interesting, actually. And it's depending on the time period between, or I'm looking at 8 specific years for which the documentation is so good that I can basically track everybody who's working in one specific place. And this place should have the rich people included, as well as the poor people and the middle class and so forth. So it should be very, it shouldn't be too biased in terms of we're only dealing with very poor people or something. So, and in total, there are about 500 or a little more people per year, but there are changes. So in the beginning, it's a bit smaller. And in the later years, it increases in size. So there are maybe 600, 800 people. I didn't check for a while. it's a long time. But finding information for each and every one of these participants of this organization is very time consuming, actually.
It's fantastic that you can get that amount of detail from these documents. And do you have just names of people, or do you have their names and their occupations and their familial structures?
Yeah, so it's just names and occupations most of the time, but that's a great way to kind of describe why some people are receiving less and other people are receiving more on the one hand. But there's also gender, of course, which is very interesting in our time where we are working on gender pay gap and stuff, so we can compare it to that. There are further political occurrences which we can combine this. For once, there's the war at the end of the documentary period, and incomes decrease drastically for better workers, for better paid people than for the lower ones, for example. That's very interesting. And on the other hand, there's also the reforms of Ukagina, which are taking place like in the beginning, and it will be very interesting to see if this shows up in the data, or if it's just a reform that basically does not change anything for people on the whole. Familiar structure, it's not too easy to, or it's not possible to basically find families as a unit or something, but the way people are paid actually gives a lot of information about family structure, I would say. There are three sections which are paid. There are people who receive land, those are only men, and then there are two more sectors. Again, one's men and another women, and those two together add up about 1 man to 1 woman. So it's very likely that these are, to some extent, mates, and the women have children with them, whereas the one who hold land of the organization, they probably, as I would assume, have to pay. So their wives are not working for the organization, I would guess. So. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Thank you. What city does all of these records come from?
So the records come from early dynastic, so about 24th, 5th century BC, Girzu, ancient Girzu, which is today's Tello in southern Iraq.
Thank you very much. And that, for those who are aware a little bit of the history, that's Gudai's city, I believe.
It's before him. It's Ukagina Lugalanda, but it is later Gudai's city. Yes.
Thank you. And do you know where the records in the city were found, and do you know why they were made? Were they like administrative for an overarching organization, or are they personal records?
So I think most of the documents come out of a very early French digging, and the quality of the archaeologists' work was still in development. So I don't think it's very I've not tried, to be honest. I've not tried to figure out where exactly they came from, but it's not too important, because the subscripts, so they don't use headlines like we do, but rather subscripts, and with the important information on where the tablet is written, when it's written, who wrote it, why did he write it, actually gives a lot of detail to link these tablets as belonging to one organization or one superstructure. And since they all belong together, and most of them can be dated, and the people occurring are very easy to link to each other, it's possible to take this as a whole. On the question of why they were made, it's definitely to get an overview on resource management, I would say. So in contrast to modern data, which is basically taken from income or tax paying sheets from individuals, I don't have that information. So they were listed because they were paid out basically in barley, and so their daily foodstuffs, or in wool, so they could produce a garment they were wearing, or because the fields were being administrated, and it was important to record who received which field. And finally, the organization also administrated more luxuriously goods like fruit back then, or or oil, which was used as perfume, which was or not paid then, but gifted in very special circumstances. But because they are tradable in other contexts, in later centuries, of course, but still, and all these gifts are very tradable on the one hand, and are stable. They can, and amounts, of course, they can be seen as a kind of income. If it's not like a regular salary, but something very special, but it's still income, and it's sometimes a lot more worth than just a regular salary of a normal person.
Thank you. Would these records have been kept by the temple or by the palace, or we don't really know that?
Okay, so there's been research going on a long time before what I'm doing, and at the beginning it was called this temple society. So because the organization I'm looking at started as basically and it's still in discussion, but less something like the house of the queen's house maybe, and later it was it developed into the house of the goddess Bao, and then that was of course understood as a temple. So the whole work of the whole buildup of the society was characterized as a society where temples were the important ground building structure for the whole society. But recent articles have shown that, especially economic contexts regarding trade with other cities, other countries, the palace was actually the most important player, and the temples did not have probably the power or the ability to really make fortunes with that. But I would, looking at the documents, because in these expense lists for the most other important people, because this is the queen, so she plays a very important role, and when there are festivities undertaken by her, the other heads of the state, the other temple heads, or then generals, etc., they all are invited. So it's possible to know who are the other important people, and from other places, it's possible to see that these also have large organizations, and probably in correlation with the amounts they gift to the queen, it can be understood how economically powerful they were. And then there are, from that perspective on, there is in every city one very big structure, usually a temple, which in the case of the capital is of course controlled by the king. And then there are slowly smaller organizations which also play a role. So like the palace, probably in this case, the house of the queen, or later temple of the Bao. And then there are some further organizations going down to households, which are still able to have a kind of free presence, so there's an important general who bought himself a house and has his family and some people working for him. And then if we go down, they are then, the next step is basically being incorporated in one of those larger or smaller organizations.
Lovely. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic answer. We have one audience question before I let you go and get on with your evening. Can you tell if any of the authors of these accounts were being less than honest? So was anyone lying when they wrote out these records? I appreciate that's probably a really difficult thing to be able to know, looking at what you have.
I don't think they're too dishonest, and I'm going to tell you why. The chief responsible person is also the by far, and I mean very far, best paid person of the institution, of the organization, I'm sorry. So no, I don't think he needs to be dishonest any further. He's
already being very well compensated.
And more on the one hand, but it does not mean that they don't change their minds. So there's a very important text where they write up, and that's what I've been working on the last days. So where they write up how much how many fields or how large each field is to be for everybody who is able to derive harvest by himself. And then there is another document where one of those fields is again being measured out from the same year, and the sizes differ a little. So it seems the plan had to be changed to fit the needs here and there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Felix, for joining me and for telling us about your research.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course, best of luck this summer, and I'll be in touch in a couple of weeks.
Thank you very much.
Bye. That was Felix, everybody. I greatly admire people who work on economic texts because they just, I don't know if it's my brain or how I've been trained, but I look at them and I absolutely cannot get any useful information. And then people like this come along and reconstruct entire worlds, and it's admirable and wonderful. And I love hearing about how they do it. So that was wonderful. We are going to take a very brief couple of minutes break, so we keep everybody on schedule, and then we will be back with our next applicant. Stay tuned. Hello again, everybody. We are ready to get going with our third candidate of the day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me? Most important question at the beginning.
Yes, definitely. No, you're coming through loud and clear.
Okay,
could you
perfect.
introduce yourself and tell us where you're studying?
Yes, I'm a PhD student here in Berlin. My name is Maysara, or Maysara Cecine in German. And yeah, I'm working also part-time at the Vorderasiatisches Museum here in Berlin.
Lovely, thank you. And how did you get into Assyriology?
Well, actually, I studied archaeology of the ancient Near East as a focus at the University, Freie Universität, also here in Berlin. And yeah, well, I have to admit, it started all with Indiana Jones when I was a little child. I'm sorry, I have to.
No, he's responsible for a lot, but getting people into archaeology is something I can always support.
Okay, great. Even if it does not mean that this is archaeology at all. So, and well, at the beginning, I was a bit, let's say, focused on other field of study. So I studied for a BA Cultural Sciences, and I had a great professor who was really involved in showing us also sites, and he organized excursion trips to other countries to see really what we are reading about. And then I just decided to do a master's program in archaeology of the ancient East. And now I'm a PhD student. I'm very lucky to continue with research in this field of study.
Wonderful. So what areas in particular of archaeology are you focusing on for your PhD?
Well, so basically it's focused on construction processes of glazed architecture. So I'm mostly interested in the question how these ancient temples and palaces from the first millennium BCE, how they were built and by whom actually. Because usually for the ancient Near East, we have several sites where those palaces and temples got glazed walls of facades decorated with glazed bricks. And this is basically what I'm interested in.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. Are you concentrating on specific buildings or just the process as a whole?
That's a good question. So for now, maybe I have to do another addition to that because we do have for several sites in the northern part of Iraq today, or also in the southern part of Iraq, as well as in Iran. We do have sites where we have glazed bricks, which contain different types of marks. For example, stamp impressions on the bottom surfaces of the bricks, or painted signs and symbols on the top. And those little studied marks, they are the key to understand how the ancient craftsmen and builders put these walls together. And this is what I'm studying or asking myself, how they organize themselves at the site in order to build up the facades of temples and palaces. And it's a general overview because for now, we do not have a comparative analysis so far in our field of study. There's no final publication discussing the different types of marks occurring on those bricks. And this is what I'm also trying to do in my PhD project.
Fascinating. Thank you. So can you, and you may not be able to answer this, so if you can't, I'm sorry. Can you explain what we do know of the process and how these bricks were assembled?
Like, for example, we do know that there are also stamped brick inscriptions, like also from the second millennium BCE, describing the king Tiglath-Pileser the first built the temple of Ashur in Ashur. I was responsible. So this is the most common impression we can find, let's say, on bricks. But we do have also like figurative stamp impressions, which can be linked for the workshop constructing or molding the bricks made of clay. And this is like one workshop which was involved in this process of building these facades, let's say. And then we do have glazed, or let's say painted, symbols or signs on top of the glazed bricks. And those signs can be linked to the glaze makers or even those masons building up the facades at site in front of the temple or the final place where it has to be in the end for assembling the bricks together. Yeah, so far.
Fantastic. And do we know like things as intricate as glaze recipes, or is that something that hasn't been
Also, we
reconstructed
do
yet?
find glaze recipes in the textual evidence. This is very important and interesting question. And what I try to do also in my PhD project is to see or to check or to do further research on other text sources in order to find out if there was a specific terminology used in order to describe, let's say, signs or symbols like fittest marks, which I was talking about now, like those signs painted or glazed on top of the glazed bricks.
Lovely.
But for now, I cannot answer this question. I'm still in
Absolutely.
the process of writing, but I'm curious to find that out too, to see not just the archaeological evidence, the objects. I mean, I'm fascinated by the glazed bricks and also how they produced those bricks, let's say, but also to check what they did know and what they described in texts or in letters, for example, how they discussed the process of organizing such huge and massive building events. You cannot, you can imagine, but like for the audience, maybe there had to be so much space in order to produce bricks at first and then to build them up. And it's incredible how it worked. And we do not know for sure how it worked for the first millennium. We have certain clues according to the marks and to the nature, let's say, of the glazed bricks. But it's still a process and a study, and it differs also from, let's say, the beginning of the first millennium BCE, and also in the middle, like for the Neo-Assyrian period, and also for the Achaemenid period in the second half of the first millennium. So this is very interesting, and certain traditions stayed the same, and others differed from side to side. So, yeah.
That's absolutely fascinating.
I think so too.
Going back briefly to the marks that you've been talking about, were these were guides to show people kind of the order in which the bricks should go? Is there more information that the marks convey, or is it mainly just a physical placement?
Well, due to the fact that a comparative analysis is still missing, I can just barely answer this question for now. I'm still trying to figure it out. But so if we're talking, for example, for the Neo-Assyrian site Ashur, which is located now in the northern part of Iraq, I can say that we do have also different systems according to different time periods or kings, let's say, who ruled at Ashur and who had different building events, let's say. So this is not just a question of how the workmen organize themselves. It's also a question linked to how certain technologies changed over time from king to king, let's say. Which is also a very fascinating question for me personally, because I would like to see, does the knowledge of craftsmen and workers, did it stay the same for the periods? Because we know, for example, in the Achaemenid period, those marks I was talking about glazed on top of the surfaces of the bricks, they were still used at the time. So over 600 years, we can see a continuation of these type of marks. Yeah. But if we look at the Seleucid era, like in the 3rd century BCE, we do have also glazed bricks from Uruk. And for now, there's no indication of marks which were used in order to help building up these temple palaces or facades.
Fascinating. Yeah. Thank you. So looking towards the summer, what are your specific research plans?
Yeah, so part of my PhD project is also to check like glazed bricks, which are stored also in other or various museums around the world. Let's say at the Louvre in Paris, or at the British Museum in London. And actually, I had already research trips planned for last year. But due to the pandemic, I had to cancel all of it. And still, I'm not sure if it will be possible this year. I mean, you all know here in Germany, we are not that fast in getting the vaccine to everyone. So I'm not vaccinated yet. But I hope that it will be possible maybe at the end of this summer to to actually do this research trips to the Louvre and to the British Museum in London.
So
And
when...
sorry.
Oh, no, please carry on.
Yeah, this is the plan for the summer, and I'm still hoping and working on that it will will be possible. So the scholarship would be a great financial support of organizing this trip. I would count 3 to 6 days at least at each museum in order to see and check the material for marks occurring on them. And if not, I would try to finish up summarizing all results I have so far for Babylonian and Assyrian marks in my PhD.
Thank you. I have one more question, and then we have a couple of audience questions to take as well.
Okay. I hope I can answer them.
If you can't, they are very used to me telling them that I just don't know. So
okay,
absolutely fine.
Great.
And I kind of prep them as well that these are students who haven't finished their research. So
okay, great.
We'll ask, and if it can't be answered, then we will move on. Do you know how many bricks you're working with for your dissertation?
So basically I refer to, let's say, about 3,000 bricks from Ashur. This is also part of my work at the museum in the project I'm doing. But in the project, I just focus on the bricks belonging to the facades of the Ashur temple in Ashur. So this is a clear distinction between, this is these are the aims of the project for the museum. And in my dissertation, I look at all the bricks we found and we have at the museum. Then there's a few published Neo-Babylonian bricks. So I think there are about 30 or so. This is the main data, let's say, in my database so far. So I would love to also include bricks from other sites, which I could restudy, let's say, from Nimrud, Khorsabad, other sites in the northern and southern part of Iraq, but also in Iran, from Susa or Persepolis. But for now, I have the material which I've checked and also the information which I can find in the publications. And so I think at the end there will be around 4,000 bricks I'm restudying and gathering together.
Thank you.
Sure.
So first audience question, would I be right in thinking that the blue glazed bricks were more expensive than other colors?
It depends what kind of metal oxide they used in order to produce this blue. And we had this discussion in a workshop 1 week ago or 2 weeks ago. And but it's a very good question. So usually we know that copper or cobalt, I'm not sure if it's the right translation in English, was used. And we know that the metal oxides, in order to produce them, this pigment production was such it's also very hard to understand. How did they know where to find it, and how did they know how to produce it and then to apply it? Because we do not have a certain description telling us each step by step. And so for lapis lazuli, for example, it would be more expensive, let's say, in order to produce this kind of blue or deep blue or purple blue. But for copper and cobalt, I think the ores or places where to find it have been given for, I think, the northern and southern part of Iraq.
Thank you. And the second question, and then we will let you get on with your evening.
Oh, wow. It's running fast. Oh, wow. I'm just getting warm now and started.
We'll have you back and do a whole show on bricks and
please,
glazes.
I would love to. That more people study glazed bricks. They are amazing. They can tell so many things.
So what... do we know the origin of the blue exterior motif of temples? Is it something that was historically common in Mesopotamia, or does it have a particular significance?
I think it depends on what time we're talking about and which sites. So we know different symbols for gods stayed the same. So if we look at the dragon behind you, the Mushushu, we know that it is Marduk, for the god of Marduk, let's say. or that we do know, but I'm not sure if it's the origin since always. I think there are different time periods, and we do know certain gods stayed the same, but on the other side, I'm not so sure about linking it directly with the glazed bricks, because we got, for example, another question concerning the glazed rosette motifs, like this flower. Like, what does it mean? What does it stand for? And actually, we do not know. We know that you can connect the symbol or this motif with a goddess, Ishtar. But Ishtar, the goddess herself, had different functions for war, but also for nutrition and being the mother of the earth and stuff. So, yeah, I would not be so sure about that. And yeah, this is what I could answer. I hope it answers the question.
Excellent answer. Thank you so much. And yeah, we are at time, so I am going to say goodbye, and you can go and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your great work. I admire your YouTube channel, and you should I mean, it's great that people like you try to promote this knowledge. It's amazing. I like the job.
I appreciate you saying that. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening, and I'll email you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you. You too. Thank you very much. Bye.
Glazed bricks, everybody. Honestly, you can tell that I am a fan of a good glazed brick. So what's not to love about that whole conversation? We are going to take a 4-minute break just to make sure we're keeping everything on time, and we will be right back. And hello again, everybody. We are back for our 4th and final interview of this block and the last interview for today. So thank you all for sticking with us. It's been a fascinating ride. Hi, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, hi.
Could you maybe introduce yourself and tell the audience where you're currently studying?
Sure. So, of course, my name is Matthew Ong. I am a PhD student in Assyriology at UC Berkeley, that is in
Thank you.
California.
And how did you get into Assyriology, Matthew?
How did I get into it? I guess it's actually quite a random story, or maybe a half random story, in the sense that I majored in mathematics as an undergraduate quite a long time ago. And but at the same time, I had an interest in languages and philology and such. And so I studied some classics at the time. But after that, I sort of decided to leave the mathematics PhD track and wanted to explore things like Indo-European linguistics at UCLA. So that's in Los Angeles. And I happened at the time to was sort of sitting in classes, and then I sat in a class on ancient Near Eastern history, and I kind of needed a summer job, and the professor there said he had a summer job doing some essentially kind of data project, as a digital humanities project, and I signed up for it. And because I got to learn more about it, and I sort of needed something to do with the future, sort of exploring academics, I sort of kind of just thought, well, I might as well start doing Assyriology, and then that's kind of how it's been ever since. I think, really.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
So, what's your personal research interests in Assyriology?
So I mean, that's what my thesis is in, or I mean, I have a number of interests, but the one that I'm working on now is essentially uh, questions of realism and poetic representation using some tools from cognitive linguistics. So, in particular, how do we use conceptual metaphor theory and one might call it construction grammar to look at kind of how the imagination works in a certain set of texts that I found interesting.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. Which texts are you working with?
So one of them is Little Bel Nemeky, which is the Babylonian Job. Another set of texts are sort of what they call syncretic hymns, where they basically take the body of one of the main gods and say something like, well, the head of this god is like something, like maybe something like a plant or a fruit, or the body is something like a palm, like a date palm tree, and it's to analogize the entire body according to the world. Another type, of course, is where they basically say that other gods are like the the manifestation or the aspect of one of the main gods in a certain domain. So something like Ninurta, who is the war god, is the Marduk of war, or the Marduk of the sword, or something. And so I think these are sort of issues of trying to essentially explain the world or some domain, some conceptual domain, taking one particular kind of concrete, what we call a frame, or basically kind of like a very salient object or set of concepts, and map them under the different parts of that world or domain.
And so this is, it sounds very interesting. Is it a difficult is it difficult to apply this kind of theory to a language that is not your own native language, but also one that's been dead for several thousand years at this point?
Yes, actually, some of it is, right, in the sense that what we would really like is to have native cultural intuitions as well. Well, it's not really so much linguistic intuitions, because I think so. This theory in particular is really conceptual at its heart. So unlike sort of other types of linguistic theories that Chomsky has invented, essentially, it really emphasizes much more kind of basic cognitive functions. And so it says that language comes out of actually thought, rather than language just being hardwired into our head. So to a certain extent, it's not like we really need native intuitions about how the grammar works, but a lot of it is actually cultural, because as you probably know, reading ancient texts does require a lot of knowledge of the background. Sometimes they're making allusions, and this is that kind of problem, in the sense that sometimes they make equations that we can't really figure out, and that seems to be because there's cultural illusions, or just, I guess we only have one example of that text, and if we had more, maybe we could see better, we could understand it better.
Thank you very much. What are your plans for the summer then, and how can HAPS help you with them?
So actually, last summer I started, as part of a summer research grant with an undergraduate, constructing an online database. It's not that it's online isn't the crucial thing. It's essentially an electronic database of metaphors for Akkadian, and that's modeled on a metaphor database that Berkeley has for English called MetaNet. And MetaNet is one of I guess it still is. I mean, it was and still is one of the major kind of examples of how one applies this theory to analyzing the metaphors of a particular language. And I mean, as a database, it's linked in the sense that you take all sorts of metaphors in that language, and then you analyze this, in a sense, their components, and then you can link them together, and then you can start doing queries on them, and you can have other people, if you put it online, you can have them see it and also build it as a sort of a wiki or a group project.
Mm-hmm.
So I've started doing that with Acadian, and I plan to sort of continue that over the summer. And but it's like I have to do other things. I have to write on the thesis. I might have to do some work or something. But I guess that's kind of it's a long-term project, of course.
Mm-hmm.
I just barely got started.
It sounds like a very, very worthwhile project. And I'm always a fan of having this kind of information more freely available than it maybe currently is. When we look at metaphors in Akkadian, do they work strictly in the same way that they might do in English, or are there other things that you have to bear in mind when you're trying to get to their meaning?
If they work. Well, yeah, in a way they do. It's not so much that it's not that they are completely functionally or structurally different. It's just that I'd say they take a kind of structure which is maybe in the particular genre of writing that they're occurring in. They tend to be much more prominent, and they seem to have a different function.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could kind of give an example.
Please, that would be great.
Well, so I mean, what we call, it's not exactly a metaphor, so I'm simplifying a bit. It's actually what we call a blending. So it's a more complicated structure. Essentially, if you take X is Y, right? Like my love is a rose or something, right? That's seen as a typical kind of a metaphor in English. I mean, it's said to be a typical metaphor in English, right? Although once again, it's not quite a metaphor. And also, the important thing is actually when you look at the way metaphors actually work in English poetry, or even in our sort of everyday speech, we don't actually use that a lot as in the way that metaphors are supposed to work. But it does actually seem to be a very important structure in some of the texts that I look at, like those syncretic hymns. And that seems to be because there's an attempt to kind of, as I said, sort of map certain features from very, like that example I gave where it said, you have different domains of the human world, like war or agriculture or gods, like Ninurta is the Marduk of war, or Ishtar is the Marduk of love or something, or that kind of mapping project, one might say, is very amenable to those X is Y types of. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's really not X is Y. It's X is the Y of Z. So, so actually, I was maybe a little bit imprecise in that we do have that structure in English. We say something like Iraq is the Vietnam. What is it? It is the Vietnam of the like the 2000s or something. Or I guess I can't think of maybe a much better example, but you get what I'm saying, right? Mm-hmm. X is Z, and that's actually a grammatical structure that invokes this metaphorish kind of construction. But in Akkadian, it seems to be much more prominent.
Excellent, thank you very much. And so I'm going to admit I'm a little bit out of my depth with theoretical understandings of ancient literature. So if my questions get a little odd or basic, please tell me. But can these metaphors, what can these metaphors tell us about how the people who wrote them viewed the world, and maybe how they interacted with their divinities?
Well, actually, so I think maybe there's another way, and I think that, so not using the example I just said, but I think there are certain maybe structural requirements on certain metaphors that interact with, one might say, certain cultural or theological assumptions of the culture, and they just sort of show the tension that's how they think. I mean, I guess if you're asking, how do they tell us how they think? Well, I think what the example I'm about to give might illustrate that. Mm-hmm. So it's true that in, say, Akkadian, in Babylonian culture, let's say, of the first millennium, Marduk is the head god. So there's a head god called Marduk, and that god is seen as essentially transcendent, sort of like a Yahweh figure, or a figure that, in fact, is said to be, his motives and his thoughts are said to be inscrutable. that's a famous thing about Mesopotamian and probably ancient Near Eastern religion in general, that the high gods, of course, it's their will that matters, and they are not subject to some sort of universal principles, like in maybe sort of Far Eastern lines of thought. But of course, and of course, Yahweh in the Bible is in some of his aspects is like that. But of course, oftentimes you want to talk about how the God has emotions, particularly how the God is angry or happy, because oftentimes, of course, you think the gods are angry at you. But when you actually think about how emotions, how we think about emotions, and how we try to express that in language, particularly in metaphor. And this theory of metaphor is actually a type of language. It's a theory of language which says that a lot of how we talk actually is in metaphor, even if it's not what poets or classical analysts would say is a metaphor. Well, that theory says that when we think of emotion, we are thinking of essentially the bearer of the emotion being acted upon, sort of being forced to do something, or their thoughts in some sense are being acted upon. And that is actually technically in violation of that theological view that I just said, right? That the God, not that only the thoughts are inscrutable, but in some sense they're sovereign. So it's basically just saying, right, if you have a God that is completely sovereign, omnipotent or such, what would it mean for that God to get angry? And I think what the metaphor theory shows, and it is sort of a robust theory, is that you just can't help but saying that God is moved, right? That they're being acted upon, and so I sort of show in this part of the thesis that the ways that they talk about anger, famously things like Marduk's anger, Marduk's anger is like a flood, right? Or Marduk's anger, when Marduk is angry, he's like a storm wind. I've never seen it. I've never seen those passages really discussed in the way I think a linguistic analysis would show, which is really that the metaphor of the storm or the flood. The flood I was talking about, the flood is not actually talking about anything about Marduk per se. It's talking about the effect that the human, the external witness to that anger, the bearer of the anger. I shouldn't say the bearer, the object of the anger. Sort of that's what it feels for them. It's not what Marduk feels like. And to make that clear, right? In English, we talk about anger all the time in this way of the subject being affected. Like I was something like I was electrified with excitement, or I was boiling with anger, or something. Those are metaphors that talk about how you internally are feeling. But that is a very different example, like from the flood one. But I think everyone assumes that the flood metaphor with Marduk is like the boiling anger one, but it isn't. And I think that's a very interesting fact, right? It's like
that's an interesting distinction.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, one could say people have often I don't know if they've often asked, but they do sometimes ask, how do you express the ineffable? It's sort of like that question, just made more concrete and sort of technical.
No, that's very interesting. Thank you. I have one more question, and then we don't have any audience questions, so I'll let you go after this. Are there metaphors that reoccur across the different texts, or are they more contained within their own compositions?
I would say that there's a fairly widespread set of metaphors, just having to do with divinity. So one of them is essentially when they talk about the gods or some kind of numinous thing as brilliant or shining. And in fact, something like, maybe a very particular one is something like they're clothed in either light, some sort of what we call like melamu, or various words that indicate both sort of brilliance, but also kind of overwhelming. It's brilliance which comes with the associations of reverence and fear, and awesomeness, basically, right? Whatever melamu means. And that is a metaphor, being clothed in it. And yet I guess it's been recognized, of course, that the idea is somehow that that divine thing is causing just like rays sort of come out from you, or the fact that when you're clothed in something, there's some sort of external kind of shroud about, or even that's a metaphor, but there's a projection in some sense of some causal causal thing that makes you feel reverence or something, and it works like light, and yet it also works like clothing. That's a very common thing. And of course, I think, once again, maybe people have not really technically analyzed how the metaphor works until, except for maybe recently. You know, there's been some stuff about the materiality of divinity and such, but that's very common, and it happens even in the, I think, in the Bible. So.
Wonderful. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for your time and for explaining your research. It sounds fascinating, and we'll be in touch in a couple of weeks.
Okay.
Have a lovely evening. Bye.
Bye.
I removed the wrong person. You can tell when I'm getting tired, can't you? That sounds amazing. Like I told Matthew, I am definitely not a conceptual linguist, but that sounds absolutely fascinating. I'm just gonna have to read everybody's dissertations when they're done. Read and educate myself when I have a spare 5 years, I think, to read all of the 56 dissertations we've heard about over the past few weeks. Thank you all for sticking with me. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you. We will be back next week. I haven't set the times. We don't have a schedule yet for interviews, but I think we have 5 or 6 interviews to get through. And next week will be a bit of a mix, because it's the people who either didn't fit in one of the fields that we used to divide our candidates, or they're people who just couldn't make their original interview slots. So it will be interesting, it will be varied, and I hope you can all join us. And thank you so much for joining us this weekend. It was my absolute pleasure. Have a good week.